Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Live with the League of 2025. Fortunately, Emily's feeling a little bit under the weather today, so it's just going to be the SFAD team joining you today, but we'll walk you through a few things and let's get started. Some of you may have joined us late in December as we had live with the league on December 23rd, maybe the latest one we've ever had after a 3 week active and intense lame duck. And so we're going to recap a couple of those things today. We're going to talk about what's happened in the first couple weeks of the year so far, and then sort of talk about what may be happening in the next few weeks as we anticipate some potential big issues could come up, and then where we see the legislative session going over the course of the next year. I think for some of you joining us today, you may be participating in our internal committees, and we look forward to maybe seeing you next week at our committee kickoff here in Lansing. So thank you for your participation and effort in that. And with that, Jen, I'm going to come right to you this morning to sort of talk a little bit about how we closed 2023, not from an issue standpoint, but just kind of the tone of the legislature and a few of the things that happened.
I think we closed exhausted, a little frustrated, happy that it was finally over. But all in all, I think we ended, in terms of the work we were doing for our members, we ended very well. And we ended in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, there's no question about that. Now, not only did we end well, but we got one of our major priorities across the board. So if Harrisani, you want to quickly talk about the Ground Emergency Medical Transportation Program, and our fingers crossed that the governor will be signing this shortly.
Sure, John. So thanks for that. And yeah, so the Ground Emergency Medical Transportation, House Bill 5695, is an item that we've had as a high priority for the league and one that we've been working on all year long. So 5695 comes from Representative Mike McFall, and what that bill would do is that it would provide for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services to amend their state plan and opt into the Ground Emergency Medical Transportation Program. This is a program that's operated by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And what it would do is that for public providers, local governments that provide emergency medical services for the transportation cost of Medicaid patients, they would receive the full federal reimbursement. So this number varies from community to community, but collectively we could see between $60 and $80 million coming back to the state of Michigan annually if we were accepted into this program. And so by the passage of 5695, we'll be able to initiate that process, amending our state plan. And also, we were able to secure during the last budget $500,000 to support the agency's work in implementing and standing up the plan. And so we'll actually get to see those dollars go forward in practice. Yes, as John said, fingers crossed that the governor signs the bill. But in that late night session that we had with the Senate, this was one of those items that we were watching for, and it did pass with overwhelming bipartisan support, 35 to 38. So we were really excited to see that. And similarly in the House, we had very strong support in the bill from both sides. And so what that tells us is that this is a really good bill for communities all across the state of Michigan. And it would be a hard point for the governor not to sign it. So we're optimistic. We're looking forward to that bill being signed and hopefully going into effect and supporting our members and navigating that process further.
Yeah, I think, we've been very fortunate over the last few years to have access to federal resources. While this isn't a part of those that were sort of COVID related, it's still a program out there that we should be taking advantage of here in Michigan. And I think there's a few thank yous to give out here as well. One to our sponsor, Representative Mike McFall, who has done a ton of work on this issue. And then we had a few really, really engaged communities. So a big thanks to Sterling Heights and Dearborn and several others that have really taken the lead and brought this to our attention and ultimately helped to get this across the finish line. So excellent work on that one, Harrisana. I know when we looked at our other top two priorities, Jen, I'm going to come to you on short-term rentals right now. We really thought that we were close to getting this one done. And, sometimes politics is at play here, and we don't need to sort of linger on that. But, where do we see this issue both ending and where do we see it going forward in the future?
Yeah, so we really had a great piece of legislation, I think, there that could have been a template for other states going forward. But it died. I'll say with the dysfunction that was happening in the House, it didn't make it out. So right now that bill is dead. Now, as for the policy, I mean, we'll continue to work on that. But looking at the makeup of the legislature, probably, it's going to be another 2 years here before we would see some action on that. I may be wrong, but we'll keep poking away at it. But I would think realistically, we will not see that policy moving forward. Even if we got it out of, started in the Senate, got out of the Senate, I don't know that the House would take it up this session, but and there is a chance that we could see a preemption bill like we have in the past pop up in the House. I don't think that would have a good chance of getting done either, but it does put us back into that defensive mode of fighting a bill versus, pushing something proactively. So, more to come. We'll see as things slowly get started here this new session.
Yeah, so I think you're right. It's a little bit of a wait and see mode, but the good news is when we push pieces of legislation like this, as much as we want to be proactive, a lot of this for people's history came out of a reactive aspect of the preemption. And so at the end of the day, while maybe the legislation didn't pass, our communities still do enjoy broad local control on this. And so that's important to remember here at the end of the day, that while maybe the legislation didn't go, our members are still in that position of authority.
Right. And that's something we've talked about. I mean, if we were able to get that proactive bill done, there would have been that 6% excise tax. But nothing happening does not hurt. We just stay the way we have been.
So I'll spend a couple minutes talking about our other final proactive piece, which was the Revenue Sharing Trust Fund. A bill that was championed, or a package of bills that was championed by Representative O'Neill and Tisdale in the House and Senator Moss and Weber in the Senate. Ultimately, over a year ago, we were able to move those bills out of the House into the Senate, and then had some hope all the way up into the last few hours that we may see some action on the Revenue Sharing Trust Fund. And unfortunately, and Jen had mentioned kind of the chaos in the House and some of the things that took place there, we weren't ultimately able to get that done. I do think there is some renewed hope, though, as there typically is to begin the next session, that this is something that's going to be entirely possible and achievable. We're going to make it, again, a top priority of the organization. And then in conjunction with that, we also had talked previously about the Public Safety Trust Fund, which was included in the budget, would have delivered $75 million to communities across the state for police services. Those bills, which were House Bill 4605 and 4606, did not pass. And as a result, that $75 million will not be distributed because they were known as budget implementation bills. Now, what we have seen in the first couple of weeks here is that there continues to be interest in getting that done. And even Speaker Matt Hall saying specifically it was a priority of his. So when we think about resources that are coming to or could continue to come to local government, both of those trust funds that we have pushed for and supported continue to be at the forefront of conversation, and hopefully here in the first part of this year at the forefront of passage. And so we'll continue to move forward on those. I think the hard part about lame duck is understanding that there are sometimes things that don't happen. And sometimes the things that don't happen are just as good as the things that do happen. And Dave, I know you worked on one really, really critical issue for our members dealing with minimum staffing. And that bill ultimately at the end of the day did not pass. But if you could just sort of talk about the process, what happened, and ultimately where we landed on that.
Yeah, so there was House Bill 4688 and Senate Bill 1167. 1167 made a little bit more progress toward the end, having passed out of the Senate chamber going into the House. But ultimately, both of these bills would have mandated minimum staffing levels during a collective bargaining process. And that, as we talked about several times, was a real concern to us. 4688, we had testified close to a year ago at this point, and it made out of committee, and then it kind of stalled out on the House floor, and then it just seemed to resurface in the form of 1167 over on the Senate side as a new introduction towards the end of the year. And so it was all hands on deck kind of fighting that off. As you mentioned, John, ultimately it did pass the Senate, but it just did not get the legs over on the House side, thankfully, to the work we had. Representatives seem to still have the same issues when that bill came over to them. So it died at the end of session with several of the other bills that didn't make it across the finish line.
Sorry about that. We talked internally a lot about this issue just in terms of member engagement and how important and critical that is, not just on this issue, but several. But Dave, can you kind of talk about the member engagement and why that matters and sort of reassure our members listening today that they are making a difference in this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we had sent out some action alerts and things like that and did direct outreach as well with various members of districts where we had heard certain senators or representatives might be on the fence with a various issue. But it is very impactful when all of you reach out, because sometimes it's a matter of, individuals just needing to hear certain messaging, and other times it's a matter of quantity, right? It's like how many people are actually reaching out on this issue in general. And we had heard from several senators and representatives that their offices were being just flooded with phone calls and emails saying, this is going to be really detrimental to the community. Please don't pass this. And that feedback was received on our end. We were hearing that. And so if we hadn't had that feedback from members, from all of you, I'm not sure that the outcome would have necessarily been the same. At the end of the day, we had delivered the messages that we could. Lawmakers were hearing us on that, but the people pushing this legislation have a pretty big stick. And so in lieu of certain things that we do and do not have, we have a very strong membership. And so when you reach out, that's something that was heard. And I think that was enough to counter what the proponents of the bill were pushing.
That's going to be important to remember here too. It's just not engagement in lame duck that matters. It's really throughout the cycle and throughout the session that's going to allow us organizationally to continue to push the priorities of our membership. So as we ask members to do different things and be engaged in the process and follow our blog, or even tune in here on Live with the League, that engagement is proven to be critical time and time again, and we would encourage you to do so. And Dave, with that, I'm going to stick with you though, because one, there's a couple of questions coming in about, bills being transmitted to the governor and what happens to them. And, is she going to sign these? But we got a really good example with House Bill 6058 that deals with healthcare that we provide at the local level. One, can you talk a little bit about that piece of legislation and where it's at, and then how that ties to the bills being transmitted and maybe ultimately signed or not signed by the governor?
Yeah, sure. So House Bill 6058 is the legislation that deals with that publicly funded Health Contribution Act. So it's what members are able to either elect in terms of choosing to do an 80-20 option for their employee healthcare, a hard cap, or they can choose to opt out altogether. So there was some issues that we had with the language. We were able to address some of those things in terms of trying to create a floor for the 80-20 is what the legislation would have done. So in other words, municipalities would have had to start with at least a minimum contribution of 80% towards employee healthcare benefits. The hard cap also had that language in there as well, saying you have to do at least a minimum of this amount going forward. We were able to change that floor to a ceiling for the hard cap, but the minimum amount of 80% in that 80-20 option still remained. And there was some other language as well in terms of how this was going to be looked at going forward, in terms of whether or not this was going to be linked to the CPI or an average of Michigan health insurance premiums, and how they would start to set those hard cap amounts going forward. And it was so complex. We had opposed the legislation in committee. We had attempted to try and make it simpler so that we could move away from our opposition, because we did agree that there were some changes that needed to be made with the current statute, but ultimately it was something that our suggestions were not incorporated, and so our opposition remained. Unfortunately, that legislation did pass both the House and the Senate, And there is kind of a procedural limbo of time where bills have to be enrolled and then presented to the governor. And this is getting a little bit to the questions that were asked in the chat about what is the status of some of these bills. So as many of you may know, once a bill is presented to the governor, she has 14 days to make a decision as to whether or not she will sign or veto those bills. But it is upon presentation to the governor. And that limbo status is kind of where some of these bills have been in because they haven't technically been presented to her yet. And there's no constitutional or statutory requirement of when that has to be done. So these bills are really just hanging out there. You may have seen in some of the headlines in the news that there were over 100 bills that were recently presented to her after a couple weeks following the end of last session, whereas there were 9 bills that were not presented to her yet. They're still in this limbo stage of simply being enrolled. House Bill 6058 is one of those. So that shot clock, that 14-day window has not started yet. We're in a little bit of an interesting situation now because this new session has started with a new party, with a Republican speaker, and individuals who did not necessarily care for some of those bills. And because they are under no obligation for our Constitution or any existing statute to present those bills to the governor, they may just be dead. So there's really no timetable for that. There's no conversation really on whether or not they're actually going to be presented. Speaker Hall has said that as of right now, he's looking into some legal matters and doesn't really intend to send those or present them to the governor as far as he's concerned. So, John, did I miss anything on that?
No, I think full disclosure, one, we're not constitutional attorneys, and so it's hard for us to comment maybe exactly on what's going to happen at the end of the day, as Dave's alluding to here. But it wouldn't be a surprise to us if this is actually worked out in the courts at some point. I think the word that everybody's going to get hung up on is shall, as they shall present these to the governor, but the timeline in which the shall take place and who shall implement that is really undefined. And so those are the types of questions that are going to be asked and need to be answered ultimately at the end of the day, and well outside of our bounds of sort of authority to engage on. It's really an administrative aspect at this point. So a lot of interesting things taking place. And before we talk a little bit more about what was going on or is going on to start this year, Harrison, I want to come back to you because we tracked a couple of environmental issues over the course of the last session. And then again, some things that didn't ultimately make it across the finish line, like polluter pay and some others. And if you could just comment on those quickly, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So I know polluter pay was one that was top of mind for many of our member communities. This package, Senate Bill 605 through 611, led by Senator Irwin, and then also with a set in the House led by Representative Morgan, were items that were put together in an attempt to improve transparency, accountability, especially how we manage contaminated sites and to improve contaminated site cleanup across the state. Now, under the polluter pay laws, one thing that we value tremendously is our protections from liability on some of these sites, especially considering some of the circumstances in which local governments have acquired these sites. And so those are some of the protections that we were looking to retain in the package. But as you know, there was strong opposition as well from the industry community, the business community, especially going further on these laws that we've done in the past. And, from that opposition, it was really, really difficult to get momentum on the package. So as I mentioned, we had extensive work group meetings led by the Department of Energy, Great Lakes and Environment, EGLE, which we talked about the bills, broke them down in context, specifically Senate Bill 605 and 606. Ultimately, though, those bills were passed through the Senate and then they ended up dying in the House. And so those are one of those items where we recognize that while we did a lot of work to improve the bills and get them in a place that we could be potentially neutral on, we were also in a situation where they just weren't going to move forward. So again, we're no worse off than we were at the beginning of this. And again, kind of to the points that we shared earlier, like this might be an item that we may not see again in the next 2 years, but looking at later years, especially if there's a shift again, it's likely that we could see some more prescriptive environmental policies move forward. Another big one that maybe had a little bit more of a dramatic ending was tipping fees. And so we've been discussing tipping fees ever since the governor's executive recommendation last year, where she put in an increase of the surcharge up to $5 per ton, raising that from 36 cents per ton. And so, yes, it's a drastic jump, but we are, as a Midwest state, particularly Michigan, we have some of the lowest solid waste surcharges in the region and possibly in the country. And so that is a piece that the governor was deeply trying to correct, especially when it comes to raising additional funding for contaminated site cleanup. And so we've stayed close to that conversation since the budget, and ultimately discussions came to a head around lame duck. We saw that Representative Reggie Mittler's 5333, which was a coal ash impoundment surcharge bill. We had the tipping fees legislation moved into that. And in the context of that, there were some changes made to the proposal, particularly a significant percentage amount going to local communities that administered recycling services and were doing those recycling services so they could get, so to speak, a way for them to be partially whole based on the increase that we were looking at the surcharge. House Bill 5333 was also the bill where there was a member of the House who walked out. And so that bill wasn't able to be voted on, and subsequently the quorum was lost in the House, in which they had to stop all voting altogether. So we didn't really see any momentum on tipping fees afterwards since then. Again, one to watch in the coming years, potentially even looking at both sides, taking a crack at this, because again, we do have some pretty low surcharges here in the state. And as we think about goals around sustainability and ultimately raising revenue for our state for some of these environmental investments, tipping fees could be a vehicle to do that. Any other ones that I'm missing, John?
No, I think what's interesting here is both what you talked about, Harrison, and what Dave talked about. A lot of these are primarily party line issues. And so while we talk about, the next 2-year cycle, they may be harder to get done in a split government form. It doesn't mean that we won't see action in one chamber on this legislation. So, from an organizational standpoint, we could still be very much engaged in these things in a particular chamber, where ultimately they might not move over the 2-year cycle. An area where that might not be true, though, is housing, where we expect a lot of activity to potentially take place. And there were some housing bills that were on the agenda in the House towards the end of the year that ultimately didn't pass, but may have had some bipartisan support. And so we may see some of those come up again. So Jen, if you could talk about those a little bit, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so those were preemption bills, and I know many of our members that I've talked to, there was one of the bills dealt with parking, and that you couldn't require more than 1.5 parking spaces for residential. Have no parking standards, or have one parking, so have even lower thresholds. And then the other one dealt with duplexes by right in any residential districts or anywhere you allowed single family. And, many of our members have updated zoning to already allow that. And so from our perspective, we were pushing back on, we have folks making these reforms and they're not showing any increase in housing. We had a member that came up and testified in committee with me, who 2 years ago said it'd been over 2 years, changed these standards, and they'd had 0 duplex projects and 2 housing projects, but they were high-end apartments or townhome developments. So nothing helping in the affordability factor of housing as well. So I'm pretty sure we're going to see those make their way back to a committee or being introduced. And so what I'm really looking for is, if your community has taken some of these, steps to update your zoning and reformed your zoning, to reach out and let me know that. Email me. If you allow accessory dwelling units by right, duplexes, if you have the standards that you have done, and if it's something where you've done it a couple of years, any of the results, how many permits have resulted in, that change. If it's brand new, I still want to know that too. We're trying to kind of get some data together to help tell the stories of what our communities are already doing, whether you're participating in the RRC program, whether you have been using the zoning toolkit, the zoning reform toolkit, Patternbook Homes. The state of Michigan has been providing funding, for all of these capacity building measures, and many of our communities have taken advantage of those and still need the time just to allow for those changes to produce some results if they're going to. And so, we're trying to tell the story of what communities are already doing, what results they've been getting, and that there's not a need to preempt. And I know we had pushback from some of our members that they were supportive of that because their community was already doing that. And I get that. But what's the next step in preemption where you're not going to be supportive of it, but we've had these, other preemption steps leading towards housing, and this is another one. And so those set precedent. And so that's why we continue to push back. We didn't have members asking us to support the legislation necessarily. We definitely had members asking us to oppose it.
Yeah, I think what we've seen, really across the country, is a lot of preemption on local control when it comes to housing, particularly around, regulation and zoning. And we haven't seen that here, by and large, in the state of Michigan. And we're working hard in various ways in which to address that. I know through our coalition work, with our partners outside of local government. And then I know we have several legislators this year that are going to be interested in having this conversation, and one that we hope to lead on and continue to be an example across this country of how to handle housing appropriately. We're fortunate here to have some people point out some data to us every once in a while. I know we had a colleague of ours point out some data on workforce, in the construction aspect, and how many construction jobs we've lost, and how that plays into cost as it relates to housing. We can do nothing as it relates to interest rates, and several other things. So we are a component of it, but we are not the primary driver of cost increases all the time at the local level. So being able to work in that space is going to be critical. So I'm going to talk just briefly about a few other things. I know there are several items we actually won't touch on today. If there's a question you may have, feel free to ask that, and then Betsy can put our full lame duck recap into the chat so you can see some of those other things that are out there. But in the list of things that we were able to hold off, one of the big issues that we engaged in on was water affordability, and the idea of adding a $2 fee to each individual bill that was out there, something that we opposed. It was a big topic in lame duck, as it ended up making its way into the headlines as a priority of at least one legislator in particular, but really as a caucus, both the House Dems and the Senate Dems, to try to get done. And ultimately that legislation was not able to move forward. And for us, we've talked about this a lot. It's not the idea of creating an affordability program and trying to help those that need it. It was the mechanism by which they chose to do that. And we have praised in many ways Senator Chang's involvement and passion for that issue. And she actually just reached out again and said, hey, will you re-engage in the conversation, because she wants to talk about that again in 2025. And we will do that and continue to brief and update our members on that situation. But, it's another one of those issues that, while it may have not ultimately made its way to the governor's desk at the end of last year, will continue to be a topic of discussion as we enter 2025 and through the next 2-year legislative session. And in addition to that, there were a few other things that I think are of note to mention that did not pass. One, preemption of siting of aggregate mines did not pass. We had a significant discussion on video franchise fees and the exemption of streamers from that. That did not pass. There were a few PPT exemptions that were out there, particularly some around electric vehicle charging stations, that didn't pass. And then some exemptions for continuing care facilities, which is a small issue in terms of the number of communities it affects. But for those communities, they are a significant portion of their tax base. And we were able to hold that off as well. I think the more interesting thing is things that we worked very hard for to try to get done that just, because of the chaos, ultimately didn't make its way forward, or at least negotiated on. And I'm looking at Dave here for a second. Dave, you don't have to comment on this, but I'm going to mention the Michigan Voting Rights Act. legislation, which is something that we spent countless hours on both internally and externally with members and legislative staff and the Secretary of State's office to find a compromised and neutral position. And again, because of the way in which the House decided to adjourn at the end of the year, was unable to see a vote on some of those things. And then the Housing and Community Development Fund, which was Senate Bill 293, which would have given more flexibility to the way in which that fund operates to really address some of the housing issues Jen was just mentioning, also didn't pass, and something we will be looking forward to trying to get done here early in this year. But now with lame duck done, and all of us getting some rest and back to our normal sleep patterns, we've seen this year kind of get off to a fast start. First day of session was last Wednesday. We have a new speaker, as was alluded to. So Representative Matt Hall is the new Speaker of the House. And we'll look forward to working with him on several issues, as he has proven last year on a couple of things, to talk significantly about the importance of local control. And we'll want to make sure we continue to hold him to that. But we see a couple of big topics right away. So Dave, I'm going to look to you, as the speaker has talked significantly, and so has Minority Leader Nesbitt, about addressing the issue around paid leave and tipped wage. And what's the latest on that?
Yeah, so there's actually been a couple bills already introduced on that for the earned sick time part. Specifically, 4002 was introduced to kind of tweak a little bit that constitutional provision that was introduced. This has been something that was a priority for Republicans, as you may recall, all through lame duck. This was kind of their tipping, no pun intended, tipping point, where they walked out of session if something wasn't to get done on that. So we do anticipate there to be quite a bit of action on this. They have set up a very specific committee to address this issue on that going forward. They are expected to meet as early as potentially next week, which is pretty significant considering the fact that the House has actually not filled out other committees at all yet. So this is a priority, to say the very least. I think it's something that you can expect. You're going to see bipartisan work on this. The Senate is also interested in taking something up on that matter as well. And so in terms of the effective date of February 21st, that is supposed to take effect, that is kind of the working timeline that we are hearing, is that they are hoping to have something done by that point. So we're constantly being asked if there's going to be any tutorials and things like that on that. Certainly we're interested in doing that. The simplest answer we can say right now, though, is that it would be difficult for us to work with people on that, not knowing what this law might actually come out in detail. So stay tuned for that. But the short answer I can give is that there is definitely an interest in seeing something done on that. Same thing really on the tipped wage part of that. Legislation's already been introduced. Another priority for Republicans, specifically working at the service staff wage and trying to at least extend the provision by which that would take effect, if not actually alter the amounts of that as well. So not a specific committee or anything to necessarily address that, but it is also legislation that has been introduced in both chambers at this point.
Yeah, and Dave, that's such an important point about, our members asking questions. What do we do? And the hard part here is making sure we provide relevant and timely information, but at the same time, not giving information that may change in the next day or week or month. And so it is something that we are aware of, and some guidance that our members may need, and we'll be looking to do and cover all of that. As a quick plug, I know we will have a labor session at our Capitol Conference in March, and this is one of the topics that we hope to cover, and we'll likely have more information at that point, just based on the timing of exactly what has transpired legislatively, and can provide some updates at that point as well. That being said, Dave, you had mentioned it, and Harrison, I'm going to kind of turn to you and Jen on this a little bit. The fact that committees officially, outside of this one select committee, haven't been announced, but we have yet to see committees officially, put in place, or really members put on those committees. But there are two things I think worth mentioning. And the first one, Harrison, I'm going to turn to you on oversight and sort of put you on the spot here a little bit and just sort of explain, what the House may be looking at and, the added importance that they're placing on the oversight process right now.
Yeah, so thanks, John. And I would add, in my limited tenure of Michigan legislature, this seems really, really weird and really intense. So we've known that the Oversight and Ethics Committee has been around for the past couple of years, oftentimes looking at scenarios where, state policy or state governance, maybe been a little wonky, and we're looking at the situation, how to fix it. The experience that's most pressing to me, of course, is unemployment insurance during the pandemic. And of course, looking at the Oversight Committee back when we were talking about elections earlier in 2020, and that got a little bit contentious. We brought in some interesting characters. Last term's Oversight and Ethics Committee, was more general. We're focusing on FOIA and OMA. This time, I think we've seen more of an investigative approach coming from the Oversight Committee as direction from the new speaker. We see, I think, at least 6 subcommittees that cover a variety of different topics, largely connected to state governance, state government's use of funding and resources. And so based on the titles of those committees, we can anticipate that a lot of the focus on oversight this year is going to be looking at actions of Governor Whitmer, Secretary of State Benson, AG Nessel, and really scrutinizing some of the activities that the decisions that they've made over the past couple of years. Everything from operating during the pandemic to even looking at how the Growing Michigan Together Council came together. There's a lot that we could speculate on, but what we do know is that oversight is going to have a very different theme and a very different manner of operation that we've seen in the past couple of years. And even looking at some of the authority that has been requested in the new House rules for those committees, particularly subpoena power, that is a significant twist that, again, in my tenure, I have not seen, and I think very much can shift the culture of how we are engaging and working with the legislature. So I think from those first 6 subcommittees that we've seen and the intention on investigation in that context, I think that's going to be something where we look simultaneously at the calendar, which is far more extensive than it was last term. We can anticipate that a substantial amount of time is going to be spent, in oversight, in those subcommittees, bringing up conversations and talking points from those different things, and hopefully, not doing too much to drive a continued wedge between the opportunity for bipartisanship in Lansing. But I'm saying from this startup, I don't really know how great that's going to be.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting dynamic, to say the least. I don't know that it's something that we should be afraid of, both internally and from a membership standpoint, but definitely something to be aware of, as some of these subcommittees may look at funding that has been utilized to prop up communities through enhancement grants and other forms. What they may look at and what particular ones they may look at is unknown, but just something that we have to pay attention to, and definitely a different dynamic than what we've seen before. And Harrison, I thought you had alluded to this well, is they're going to be a lot busier. By the numbers, right? They have 64 days scheduled between now and the end of June in the House, and they only met 55 days all of last year. So for us internally and how we manage that, it's going to be a very different sort of tone and feel, but one that we shouldn't, be afraid of, as I had mentioned. I think one that we can actually welcome is that's when we do our best work. I think the other thing, though, is maybe what's missing. And I don't want to speculate too much on this, but I do think it's something as we think about how legislation we look at is dealt with and where that legislation goes, there's a surprising aspect to what the House may be doing. Jen, if you want to quickly mention that.
So in, the makeup of the committee names that have been put forward so far, there is one that is absent for us, and that is the Local Government and Municipal Finance Committee. It's been called different things, but there is usually a local government committee in the House. We'll still have the local government committee in the Senate, but there's not a local government specific committee in the House. So really, begs the question of legislation dealing with local government. Where will that be sent? There's still, I believe, a finance or tax policy committee. The economic development and small business committee has been changed to economic competitiveness. So I could see possibly local government bills going there. But yeah, that was one thing that is definitely a change in this new session.
Yeah, and local government committee will remain in the Senate. So it will be interesting to see how bills that go to local gov in the Senate, once they're transmitted to the House, where do they find a landing spot? And again, I think we're trying to point out sort of the nuances of the new session that are coming up, not necessarily the problems, because we're not assuming that there are going to be any with this, because we still deal with them as they come about in terms of issues, no matter what committee they go to. But they are just things for our membership to be aware of, as we typically talk in generalities at times about bills going to local government committee and being one of the most regular landing spots for pieces of legislation. And it'll just be a little different this time around.
Yeah. And I think Dave or someone might have mentioned this earlier. I mean, we don't even know who's sitting on committees yet, in, the makeup of those committees. So, to ask, a member to talk to their rep because they're on a specific committee, we can't even do that yet. So more to come, and yeah, nothing to be worried about. Just changes from years past.
Yeah. So I want to bring this to a close today and thank everybody for joining. And as we enter a new session, obviously there's always a lot of unknowns like we talked about here, and eventually we'll understand the kind of the cadence and the rhythm of how both the House is going to work, how the House is going to interact with the Senate, and then ultimately how the House and the Senate will interact with the administration. And there are several things that we will be tracking closely over the next few weeks. Obviously, we talked about the initial legislation that was introduced on paid leave and tipped wage. The consensus revenue estimating conference just happened at the end of last week, which showed state revenue is up a little bit. And so that will lead to budget discussions and negotiations on how to handle that excess revenue. We will see the governor both put out her budget here in early February, as well as at some point here in the near future, schedule a state of the state address. And then ultimately, as we work through this first half of the year, trying to find a way to complete a budget by June 30, as they have over the last several years. So lots of things coming, kind of down the pike here as we look at what's going on. A lot of energy in Lansing right now as we've shifted from a Dem trifecta to shared power, and a lot of learning, as there usually is with a new session. So thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, don't forget to sign up and join us at our CapCon in March, and you can find that registration link on our webpage. And then we will be live with you again in 2 weeks on January 27th, if I look at my notes correctly. Yes, January 27th at noon. And we look forward to speaking with you again. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out, and thank you very much.